Hi, everybody. It is great to be here today, and I'm very excited for our discussion on how algorithms make decisions, how people make decisions, and the relative benefits of each. So I want to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence to start, because there's a lot of confusion about what AI is and isn't. And so artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to make decisions on our behalf, but those decisions are not always actually intelligent, right? So Siri doesn't demonstrate a lot of common sense. So we have to think about something important when we talk about AI. We have to keep in mind, what are we really talking about? So AI is a term. It sounds like there's something sentient. It sounds like there's a little brain inside the machine, right? But it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of what we think about AI is imaginary. And what's real is that artificial intelligence is just math. Okay, so the kind of AI that people are usually talking about when they say AI nowadays is a specific kind of AI called machine learning, which also sounds like there's a little brain inside the machine, but really what machine learning is computational statistics on steroids. So I want you to just keep in mind the difference between what's real about AI and what's imaginary about AI as we explore the ways that AI is being used to make decisions in the world today, and we talk about some of the exciting frontiers where it's being used. So just to frame our discussion and to help us think about the difference between how machines make decisions and how humans make decisions, we have a little film that we're going to take a look at.
Well, I'm not pretty sure what's an algorithm.
Algorithm? Say that word again?
Algorithm.
Algorithm.
I have no clue.
Oh, an algorithm. Oh boy. I'm pretty sure. I know an algorithm has something to do with a Rubik's Cube.
Be like a numbers?
Like I know Instagram's algorithm.
An algorithm is a set of guidelines that describe how to perform a task.
Well, I'm all about rhythm, right?
So an algorithm is a recipe for a computer. It's a series of steps that a computer can execute one by one to solve a problem. In the early days of artificial intelligence, algorithms were used to search or to solve puzzles or to play chess. So it's a very useful thing. But there's a catch. And that is that for the really difficult things that we want computers to be able to do, it's like telling the difference between a cat or a dog or driving a car or making a robot walk. Turns out algorithms are not enough. And for those problems, eventually we ended up resorting to a process we call machine learning, where you don't tell the computer what to do step by step. In other words, we don't tell the computer, here's how to tell the difference between a cat and a dog. You give it examples instead of giving it rules. So you might give it 1,000 images of cats and 1,000 images of dogs. So you say, now use statistics to figure out what are the signatures of these two. Eventually, if you do it fast enough, you do it enough times, if you have enough of these neural networks arranged in a particular way, it works. All these signals flow through it, and in parallel reaches the conclusion it's a dog or a cat. And it's a black box. You can't look at rules. You can't explain to anybody how it's doing it, but it does it perfectly. It's like magic.
So we have a really exciting group of people here tonight who are going to talk with us about AI and how it functions in really important sectors of society, in medicine, in criminal justice, in the military, and philosophically. So our first guest is an economist at the University of Chicago. He's also the founder of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, where he's building AI systems to reduce bias and improve the functioning of our criminal justice system. Please welcome Jens Ludwig.
Great. Thank you very much.
Also joining us is a professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School and the chief of breast imaging at Massachusetts General Hospital. She is on a quest to use AI to detect early-stage breast cancer. We're very glad to welcome Connie Lehman.
Thank you.
Our next participant is an in-house ethicist at Google, as well as a professor of philosophy at Santa Clara University, where she focuses on the impact of technology on the human character. Please welcome Shannon Valor. Rounding out the panel is the director of the Mobile Robot Lab and the Regents Professor at Georgia Tech. He has consulted with the Pentagon, worked with DARPA and the Office of Naval Research, and he's been building robots and thinking about their role in society for more than 3 decades. Please welcome Ron Arkin. So thank you all for being here tonight. And Connie, I'd like to start by asking you about your work. You're trying to use AI for better early detection of breast cancer. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Exactly. So, my domain is in breast cancer, and this is really a global crisis. Every year, 2 million women are diagnosed around the world with breast cancer, and 600,000 die. The statistics are really, really striking. And it's a crisis that we have tried very hard to address through better imaging tools, teaching people around the world how to read mammograms. And it's a challenge. So I had an opportunity to move to Boston, and I knew there would be a lot of change as I moved from the West Coast to the East Coast. What I didn't know that I would meet this fantastic woman, Regina Barzilay. She had just finished her own breast cancer treatment at the age of 42. She was quite young when she was diagnosed, had a young son. And one of the men that recruited me to MGH and Harvard said, "You've got to meet this patient of mine. You two will do great things together." And I wasn't sure why, so we met. And she could not believe, as a computer science expert in artificial intelligence at MIT, how little information was available to guide her treatment. She also, in her own personal story, realized that at 40, she had her first mammogram. They said she had dense breast tissue, but not to worry about it, that most women do. 50% of women are told they have dense breast tissue. At 41, the same thing. At 42, they said, we see something on your mammogram. So you can see here, Regina, she went through her treatment and also her mammogram. And as we studied her mammograms together, she said, could we have seen it last year or even the year before with better tools? Could we see it as distinct from all that dense normal tissue that I have? And so we started our journey together using the tools of AI. She took her entire lab at MIT that was not working in the healthcare domain, shifted the whole group over to tackling our most challenging problems for our patients in breast cancer. And we tackled problems that our patients face using large databases that we have in Boston at Mass General Hospital, and the technologies that they had developed at MIT in deep learning. So we found that we could find cancers earlier, and also that we could use techniques to find those cancers before humans were finding them. So it wasn't unique to Regina that you could look back and say, maybe that was the cancer developing then. That's true in about 30% of breast cancers that are diagnosed. And what we realized that every woman's mammogram is unique to her, like a thumbprint. And we could, just in the way that we saw how you could take hundreds of thousands of images and sort dogs from cats. We could take hundreds of thousands of images of mammograms, and because they're unique to each woman, we knew the outcomes of those women in the future. We could train the model to know this is a woman who will develop cancer in the future, and this is a woman who will not develop breast cancer in the future, many years before a human could see anything on that mammogram that looked like a cancer. So we weren't using old school CAD, where computer data detection, where we would teach the machine to learn what a cancer looks like. We were giving many tens of thousands of mammograms with known outcomes to the machine and letting the machine learn from cues and signals that we were not teaching it. What we found in our model was that we could predict into the future for women in ways that none of our existing risk models could do. We had our training set and our testing set, and then when we actually implemented it into a large group of women, we found that we could predict the future much better than any existing models, and most importantly, we removed the racial disparities that we have been plagued with in my field. So
tell us more about that, because it's confusing to think about there being racial disparities in images of breast tissue. right? Like we think about racial disparities in what people look like, but don't we all kind of look the same inside?
You know, we don't. So it turns out as women get mammograms throughout the course of their life, their breast tissue is changing, and we see that on the x-ray. And some of those changes are because of genetics, because of aging, because of lifestyle changes. So I can look at mammograms, and my colleagues can, and say, oh, this woman has gained weight, or this woman has gone on hormone replacement, this woman has gone through menopause, this woman has had biopsies, she's had surgery, she's on tamoxifen. So we see these changes that are exhibited in the body, radiomics. So we all usually have heard about genomics, but we haven't thought as much about that rich imaging data of our bodies across x-rays and CTs and MRIs that we haven't been using. We haven't been pulling that information, that big data out to predict the future of patients.
So you're taking thousands and thousands of images of what breasts look like normally and then what breasts look like with cancer tissue in there and telling the computer, pull out the ones that have cancer tissue, and then for future images, predict the likelihood that this woman has cancer?
Exactly. So we have many different models that can be applied to address patient problems. The two that you just mentioned are ones that we're most excited about now. One is to actually read the mammogram now, for the machine to learn, is this a woman with cancer now? And we're not teaching it by pointing out the cancers and saying, learn that pattern, learn that picture. We're just giving it the mammograms where we knew that woman developed cancer that year. Now, sometimes the radiologist had missed it. So the radiologist thought the mammogram was fine, but that woman actually had a cancer in hindsight we could see, or even of more interest to me is had a cancer that we cannot see. They developed it 6 months after that negative mammogram, 8 months after that negative mammogram. It was seen on an MRI. It was felt by her doctor or by herself. So there's something there that the machine can learn. About a third of cancers that are missed, it was put in the highest risk of there is something here. And then the other model is predicting 5 years out in the future or further. Will this woman develop cancer in the future, and what can be done to reduce that risk of the cancer even developing?
And so how big is the problem you're trying to address? How big is the breast cancer problem right now?
It's a huge problem. We have made many advances in healthcare, and yet we are absolutely plagued by the fact that we have not the quality and the access and the outcomes we want in many domains of healthcare, and the costs are exorbitant. So we continue to have escalating cost, not reaching all the patients globally that we want to reach. And we have the problem of human variation. There's no performance of mammography. It's how mammography performs in the hands of the human that's interpreting it. So someone will say, well, mammography is 90% accurate. Well, that depends on who reads it. With our artificial intelligence technology and techniques and tools, we can reduce that human variation, increase access, decrease costs, and really deliver more on the promise of more precise medicine and more accurate medicine globally.
Great, thank you. And this notion of human interpretation of results, I think, comes up a lot in criminal justice as well, because one of the applications of AI nowadays is that people are trying to come up with ways to use AI in criminal justice to, say, help judges make decisions about who goes to jail and who goes free. So Jens, can you tell us a little bit about your work and maybe also about the role of human interpretation?
Sure. So there's a lot of anxiety around the growing use of AI in the public policy area, especially in the area of criminal justice. And I think in many ways it's understandable because AI at some level is just a technology, and like any technology can be misused. But from the work that we've been doing, I think there's also an enormous potential to do social good here. And so I think one way to start to see why there's potential for social good here is to think about what the status quo decision-making process is in the criminal justice system, which is human beings. So let me give you an example from the judge decision about whether to send someone to jail after they get arrested. So the way the criminal justice system works is one gets arrested. Within 48 hours, you go in front of a judge who makes a decision about whether you get to go home awaiting adjudication of your case or whether you go sit in jail. So it's a very high stakes decision because most of these cases in cities like New York and Chicago take 2 to 4 months to resolve. And the law tells the judge that they're supposed to make that decision based on a prediction of the defendant's risk, whether they're going to skip court, whether they're going to get rearrested, whether they're going to commit a violent crime. Now, one of the things that we know from this enormous literature in behavioral science over the last several decades is that this is the opposite of the sweet spot for human cognition. It's enormously difficult for people to think probabilistically. And I think I've got a picture that highlights a graph that highlights the other challenge that humans face, which is consistency. So let me just talk you through what this graph shows you. The x-axis here is essentially time of day. So these are judge decisions over the time of day. And the y-axis here is the fraction of judge decisions that are favorable for the defendant. Okay? And the two dashed vertical lines that we see in the graph here are basically snack breaks for the judge. Okay? Now, this makes for an enormously interesting natural experiment as a social scientist, but is absolutely horrifying from the perspective of a criminal justice system that's supposed to treat defendants fairly. And I think it's sort of the foundation here is the fallibility of the human beings in the system creates the potential for AI to do social good. And then what we've been working on for the last several years is to see whether it's possible for AI to actually realize that potential.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the fallibility of AI in that situation, because in the film at the beginning, which there was the mention of a black box of an AI-based decision, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer, because it is possible to understand what's happening inside the black box. It's just that it's really complicated math, and most people don't understand that math. It's really hard to talk about. So what are some of the problems that we run into? This is a question for all of you, actually. What are some of the problems that we run into when we try and use AI to make decisions, to detect things, to make social decisions?
One of the big problems is transparency, as you were referring to. And I would disagree with you to some extent to say that that information is directly recoverable. The math creates weights in those neural networks. And there is no direct correlation with the set of weights that you see with the mapping, the final selection process. So there is no rationale, no decision that has been made in the clearest sense other than a mapping into a multidimensional decision space by the inputs to the outputs. It still produces tremendous results, but the point is, if you're going to put people at risk as a consequence of that, don't they deserve an explanation?
And let me just jump in and add that the explanation that you're providing has to fit the purpose that drives that need for an explanation. And so when we're talking about the criminal justice system, even if you can provide a mathematical explanation of how the algorithm is working, that's not necessarily going to give you the kind of explanation you need, especially for an individual case, right? You can give the statistical distributions, but when you have one individual that the algorithm is saying this person is a high-risk offender, and that person wants to appeal that judgment, how do you reconstruct, as Ron said, the rationale? The problem is that these systems don't think the way humans do. They don't reason with human concepts like guilt or even concepts like risk. We interpret the mathematical process using those relevant human concepts, but we can't always reconstruct them from the specific decision that was made. So when someone says, why does this system think I am a high-risk offender? Often we can't extract that kind of explanation. We're doing a lot of research within the machine learning community on how to develop tools that will allow more relevant kinds of explanations to be generated, but there's still a lot of work to be done in that area.
I think it's interesting that you say that you bring up the statistical distribution, because a statistical distribution is not a reason, right? We have a legal system set up so that when a decision is made, we assume that there is a reason and that we can go back and look at it and articulate it. And so using these AI systems to make these decisions is just fundamentally disrupting our entire legal system.
Well, let me, I think that this is, here's a different way to think about it, which is, I leave this event, I do something dumb in Washington Square Park and I get arrested. I go in front of a judge. That's the status quo system right now. The judge looks at me and says, Jens, you're going to jail for 4 months. Under the current system, like the ultimate black box in many ways is human cognition. The judge, literally the only thing that the judge produces in the courtroom environment is the outcome of the decision process. And there's absolutely no way to interrogate the judge in their thinking about why they made the decision. And I think the other thing that's really quite striking that we've learned from decades of behavioral science is that the people themselves don't know. There's a very important book in behavioral science called Telling More Than We Know, where I think it summarizes a large body of research that basically there's something in psychology called the introspection illusion. The idea that we are able to reflect on our own cognition and think about what we're doing. And we think that we can do it, but we've seen lots and lots of experiments where we experimentally manipulate the decision-making environment. We can see that that's dramatically changing the decisions of people. And then afterwards, when we ask them, why did you decide this way or that way? Did the environment play any role? They swear up and down that their decision-making was completely independent of the environment, which we can see in the data is totally false. With the algorithm, at least in principle, if we can get the regulations and laws around algorithms right, so right now I would say we don't live in a world in which we've got the right laws and regulations for algorithms, but at least in principle, the algorithm is a tangible thing. It comes from a data set to which a piece of code is applied. We can interrogate the data set, we can interrogate the piece of code, and the code has to reveal what the outcome is that it's predicting. We can look at the output from the computer program. And so if we've got the right laws and regulations in place, at least in principle, the algorithm can be much more transparent than, at least in the criminal justice area right now, the complete black box of the human judge.
We should demand better from our algorithms than humans are doing. You exactly pointed out why humans are frail and have foibles and make mistakes. We need to find ways to do better. And whether that's through deep learning or other approaches and the like, that's a major quest for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and there's two ways of looking at this. So there's one scenario where we use algorithms in order to improve not just the outcomes, but the processes and the systems and the institutions and the forces at work in those institutions, that we use algorithms to improve all of those systems, to make them fairer, to make them more transparent, to make them more accountable. And then there's another scenario, which is the one that people like me are working to avoid, many people are working to avoid, not just ethicists, and that's the scenario where we lean on these algorithms as if they are magic. In the opening slide, it ended, or the opening presentation, it ended with a description of these algorithms as getting to a point where they work perfectly, like magic. And that's a dangerous way, actually, of conceiving of these things. First of all, none of them ever work perfectly. There's always some margin of error. And also, they're not magic. And if we think they are, we won't do the work needed to make sure that they're actually improving our systems and leading to fairer and better and more beneficial outcomes. Instead, we'll just assume that they are because they're objective, because they're math. And that's the path we don't want to take.
I also think that's where we get really concrete, because I do think with AI, we are really where we need to be implementing in concrete ways, because there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of futuristic, talk, but where we are in healthcare, we are tackling very specific patient problems that need to be addressed right now. So mammography screening is not available to the vast majority of women in the world, and the reason why is we don't have expert humans to read those mammograms. And even where we do have expert humans to read the mammograms, the performance is wildly variable. running through 200,000 images to find 6 cancers, that is not a human task. That is a computer image analysis task, and we are there and we are doing it, and we need to do that. Now, am I going to have an AI tool tell a woman whether she should live or die? Is it time for her to, go ahead and end her life? Absolutely not. But am I going to start using AI tools for real concrete problems that our patients have now? Of our 50,000 mammograms that we do every year at Mass General, they're all run through a deep learning algorithm. So there are areas or domains where we're using these now. We're using it in very specific domains that we do believe are very safe. We know how to monitor them, and we'll start building on that. But we do want to keep the guardrails up.
That's
while
right.
we're doing it.
And that's a really important distinction between learning what kinds of decisions humans are never going to be particularly good at, never going to be reliable at, and machines can be really good and really reliable, versus the kinds of decisions that really do need to remain in human hands or with human oversight, because we understand what's at stake in ways that machines can't.
Yeah, and I think that really touches on a very important and underappreciated aspect of the application of AI to lots of, especially in policy areas where I spend a lot of time working, and I think this echoes what you said, is being very, very clear on the relationship between the thing that the algorithm is predicting and the thing that society cares about in making the decision. So the reason that we very intentionally started focusing on pretrial release decisions is because the law itself says that literally the only thing the judge is supposed to care about in that initial jail or go home decision is the defendant's risk. That is not a decision about whether the defendant is guilty. It's not supposed to be a decision about what the punishment is for the crime. It's literally just contingent on the defendant risk. Contrast that with a decision like sentencing. Now you've gone through court and you've been found guilty. Now we have a question as a society of how long you should go to prison or probation or whatever it is. And it's true that understanding your recidivism risk is not irrelevant to the sentencing decision. So you can see how people are tempted to think about that as something that algorithms can help the judges decide. But when we make a decision about how long to send someone to prison, it hinges on a lot more than just recidivism risk, right? We care about things like just deserts for the offense. What is the appropriate punishment? We care about things like remorse on the part of the defendant. We care about things like the victim's opinion about what the right punishment should be. Algorithms aren't at all able to tell, so this is just echoing your point, algorithms can't tell us anything about those other human values, and I think there's a danger from introducing an algorithm that produces this very seemingly scientific thing that then becomes unusually salient and has the risk of capturing too much of the weight in the decision-making process relative to what it's actually able to tell us. And so I think matching the tool to the decision really does seem absolutely critical for AI and being socially useful moving forward.
So I want to call attention to something that I heard all four of you say, is the idea that there's going to be a human involved in an AI decision. Because I think a lot of the time we talk about AI as a kind of inevitable force, like, oh, they're going to develop an AI and the AI is going to make all the decisions. The AI is going to make the life or death decisions and we really have to figure out the ethics of that and trolley problem. But that kind of thinking suggests to me a kind of fantasy of a fully autonomous system where, say, all the radiologists are going to suddenly disappear. Right? And so I think it's really important to call attention to the role of that fantasy in these conversations and to say specifically that we're talking about human-in-the-loop systems. We're not talking about making decisions that get rid of humans entirely. Except in a very limited number of cases, which I would actually argue we really need to rethink. But a lot of these are human-in-the-loop systems, not fully autonomous systems.
I think So please, go ahead.
No, so I totally agree. I mean, AI, these are tools that humans can use, and humans will choose wisely in which problems do the tools address, how are the tools used, and how do we measure the impact of those choices. So, you know, the jobs of radiologists, they will change dramatically in the next 10 years. Our impact will be higher. We will finally provide more access to humans globally.
I have to jump in. Do
Yes.
humans really choose wisely? Do we choose economically? Do we choose for the least path of resistance?
My hope is we
Well, you
are
hope that,
called
yes.
to do that.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But the truth is, it's not always the case.
And those, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
No,
please.
no, you go ahead.
I was gonna, I was gonna say that I think it's also very important to be clear about why we want the human in the loop in a lot of these decision applications. And so, sort of building on this point, what we can see in lots of different applications in medicine and college admissions and criminal justice and so on, we can see that a statistical algorithm does better on average than the human. But just because the algorithm does better on average doesn't mean that it always does better than the human. And I think it's important to be clear on why the humans can do better than the algorithm in some cases. And so if you think about the criminal justice case, if you think about pretrial release decisions, so I teach a crime class at the University of Chicago, and every year when I teach this, I take my students to the Cook County courthouse to watch pretrial release decisions being made, and at 26th in California on the south side of the city. And if you think about what the algorithm has access to, the algorithms that we usually build for this application, they have access to the charge that someone was arrested for and their prior rap sheet, their previous history of charges and convictions and so on. And so the algorithm does that. They give you a risk prediction. The algorithm does a much better job of processing that information than the judge does. We can see that in the data. But the judge, how can the judge ever do better than the algorithm when the judge sees a lot more than what the algorithm has access to? So, one case that really made this very clear for me in the Cook County courts is we get a defendant up in front of the judge, and the prosecutor says, not much prior record, but it was assault with a weapon, aggravated battery or aggravated assault. The defendant is now in a coma in the hospital. So that is the description of the current charge. The algorithm sees no more than that. Okay, so the algorithm, I think anybody given just that information would think, oh my God, this is an incredibly high-risk defendant. Then the defense lawyer gets up there and says, Your Honor, let me tell you a little bit more. Let me tell you a little bit more about the case. My defendant is the passenger in a car driving somewhere in Chicago. They're at a red light, and someone standing on the street corner walks in front of the car, opens the door. The guy's brother-in-law is driving, pulls the brother-in-law out, and starts to beat him up in the middle of the street. The defendant gets out of the passenger side of the car, tries to get the guy off his brother-in-law, can't do it. There's a bottle in the gutter in the street, and without thinking, the guy grabs the bottle and hits the assailant in the head. Now, few of us in the room are in favor of hitting anyone in the head with a heavy glass bottle, right? But it's clear that in the circumstances, knowing the details of the case would fundamentally change your view of whether that defendant is really a danger risk to let out again, right? And so I think the real deep challenge here in applying AI to a lot of these applications is we know that the humans in lots of these applications on average are doing worse than the algorithm, but sometimes doing better. The human doesn't know in any particular case whether they're adding positive value or adding negative value. And so I think the key is to build learning systems that help the humans figure out when they have comparative advantage over the algorithm versus when the algorithm is doing a better job. And that is a hugely difficult, I think, frontier science problem that no one solved yet.
It's interesting
you
that
mentioned something about what the algorithm has access to. Because I think one of the problems in criminal justice applications has been that the algorithm has access to data that is a proxy for race. So if we look at the Compass algorithm that ProPublica famously explored a few years ago, Compass was taking into account where somebody lived. And of course, zip code in the United States is a proxy for race because we have residential segregation. So I think one of the things that that the discipline has been grappling with is the quantitative people needing to know more about the qualitative factors that go into these decisions. So Shannon, could you tell us a little bit about your work as an ethicist at Google and how you're kind of bringing together qualitative and quantitative ways of knowing?
Sure. So my background is as a philosopher of science and philosopher of technology with a special expertise in emerging technology ethics. And I've been working on those problems for over 10 years now. And one of the challenges that I've always seen as central is talking about these qualitative dimensions of technology in ways that can actually enrich the capacities of technologists themselves and scientists themselves, as opposed to being just something that philosophers talk about or philosophers use as a critical lens. And so through my university, Santa Clara University, we have a center on campus called the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics that I've been working with for many years to develop curriculum and tools for students in computer science and engineering. We developed an introduction to software engineering ethics as a free online module for people to look at. It very quickly was requested for use by over, I think at this point, 120 universities on 5 continents. So there's a clear demand for this kind of resource. And so we wanted to build that further. We started developing materials for use in industry by professional technologists, software developers, engineers. And it was through that I ended up being invited to come into Google as a visiting researcher last year and an AI ethicist to help Google implement their newly developed AI principles, which are a set of principles which are intended to help govern the design and development and implementation of AI and machine learning. And so I was invited to come in and say, okay, we have these principles. How do we put them into practice? How do we actually make sure that they are shaping the design and development and implementation of our products, of our research? And how do we do that in a way that's rigorous? And how do we do that in a way that actually reaches across the organization? So in addition to helping develop some of the internal review processes around these principles and their application to specific things that we build, I'm also working within Google on a broad education program around ethics in the technology context. And we've offered these courses not just in Mountain View, but in Zurich, in Munich. We're developing these in ways that hopefully will be able to reach all Googlers. And the idea is to help people who have the technical and quantitative expertise be able to grapple with these more qualitative questions and distinctions that they really need. Because it's not enough to have one ethicist working at a company. It's not enough to have 10 ethicists working at a company. You need to be able to hold everybody in the company accountable for understanding what's at stake from a human perspective, for understanding really what it means to develop technology responsibly. So that's the kind of work that I'm really excited to be pursuing.
And there was a case recently where Amazon tried to develop a machine learning model that would go through resumes and pick out who would be a good employee. And they found that the algorithm automatically discarded all women. If you if you had a women's college on your resume, or you played on a women's rugby team, and it would select dude's named Jared. So how is a lack of ethical training or a lack of social training feeding into developments like this?
Sure. So this is a really interesting case. I tweeted about it when it came out last year, and I think it was the tweet that got the most likes and retweets of anything I've ever done on Twitter. So there was a lot of investment in this particular story. And what's interesting about it is, to Amazon's credit, two things. First of all, they were using this to try to see if they could get an algorithm that would produce fairer outcomes than the human recruiters. They already knew that we have a problem of bias in human recruiting for technical positions, and that there is a gender bias in the way that technical positions are filled. And so they were trying to develop an algorithm that would surface high-quality candidates with less bias. And what's interesting is, and to their credit, they also, when they failed to do that, they discarded the algorithm. Right? They said, well, this didn't work. So good for them for having been attentive to that risk, for looking for it, for testing for it. And when they found the problem and weren't confident they could get rid of it, decided to go in a different direction. But let me just point out that the reason that the bias was in there, and my understanding is it didn't automatically just discard women from the pool, but it downgraded any application that had a signal that the applicant was female. And what's really interesting about this is it does this even though you can strip the gender label out of the inputs. That's the first thing you would do, right? Don't tell the algorithm whether the applicant is male or female. But to your point about proxies, that doesn't solve the problem often because it finds indirect signals of gender. It finds a pattern in the training data. Now, what's the training data? We don't know exactly, but I would bet that the training data reflects human hiring practices or promotion practices in the past. And since we know those are already heavily inflected with gender bias, it is very difficult to then strip that out of what the machine learns. Because basically, machine learning is do what we do, only better. But then how do you say
do what has been done already?
But then how do you say to an algorithm, do what we do, oh no, not like that? Right? And that's a really tricky technical problem.
And that's where I always come back to that, as humans in this domain, we have to be so careful on the problem that we're addressing, the question we're addressing, and how we think we're going to solve that. So in my domain, I have to be so careful that I'm not doing garbage in, garbage out. If I have a definite outcome, like this patient developed a breast cancer, that patient did not, I need to make sure I'm accurate. There are other domains where, one, we have to be very careful if we're using very old data. We're going to have bad outcomes. I can't do my AI work on old film screen mammography. That will not translate to modern day. I can't do my research with scattered, heterogeneous, biased data that's collected from all different centers, some that knew the outcomes of those patients, some that linked to registries, some that did not. So I think, knowing that outcome of, how people were assessed by their employers, that's already gender biased.
Yeah.
I also worry in your domain of, will this person repeat? Well, what were the interventions to support that person not to repeat?
Right.
There's racial bias there. And then so I think picking the questions, knowing the data, we're not training machines to read x-rays like humans. We're training machines to read better, knowing a very specific outcome of health and disease and how we're going to measure that.
Right, and computer scientists and data scientists aren't trained often to look for these sort of social, political, economic factors that are driving what's in the training data. So for example, one of the failure modes that we see in some of these tools are these feedback loops where a human failing is actually being amplified or magnified by the system because, again, it doesn't know the difference between a good human pattern and a bad human pattern. So in the case of predictive policing algorithms, research a couple of years ago on some of the most widely used tools for predictive policing were showing evidence of some of these feedback loops, basically. And the way it works is, if you send 3 police officers to a neighborhood, they'll arrest more people than if you send 1. So if there's a disparity in the training data between how policing is distributed across a given community, what will happen is you'll get more arrests in particular neighborhoods where there is a higher police presence. And then if you feed that data into the algorithm, what it learns is more crimes here. So what does it do? It then sends more police officers into that neighborhood, right? Because it thinks there's a difference in the base rate of crime there. So it sends more police officers. Now, now you, instead of 3 police officers, now you have 10, right? And now they find even more crimes. And that data gets fed back into the algorithm. And that you can see how this then becomes a sort of runaway negative feedback loop. And we need to be able to have the human moral intelligence to know in advance that those things can happen, to figure out how to build systems that won't amplify those kinds of bias or those kinds of harms.
I think both the Amazon example and your predictive policing examples are both examples of the same underlying problem that we talked about before, which is misalignment between what the algorithm is asked to predict and the thing that society really wants to make the decision on. So my understanding of the Amazon algorithm is that it was trained to predict, I believe, it was trained to predict who the human HR team would recommend for further interviews. Okay, so the algorithm, as you say, is just reproducing the bias of the humans. How did Amazon respond to that? They threw away the algorithm and went right back to the humans who generated the bias behind the algorithm, which seems insane. So you might then think, what could Amazon have done instead? Well, there's a bunch of research that shows that women are actually better coders than men, for instance. So why are we, for starters, predicting who the humans would pick to advance? Why don't we just predict the thing that Amazon really cares about, which is, for instance, who's a good coder versus a bad coder? Let me just mention, in the policing example too, I think, there is no police department that I have ever encountered myself that would want to allocate police on the basis of where there are arrests. Police are not that dumb, right? The thing that big city police departments care about in the United States is the thing that drives the harms of crime in American cities, unfortunately, which is gun violence. So in the cities, in Chicago and New York and other cities around the country, when they actually do this in practice, the thing that they are asking the algorithms to predict is shootings. And I think if you just think, if you think about an algorithm that's trained to predict shootings, I think all of this kind of negative feedback concern that you're talking about evaporates. And so I think that's an example of just the deep fundamental importance of making sure that the algorithm is given the task that we really want it to do to align with what society wants for the decision.
I'll push back on that only a little bit. I think that's exactly right, that we have to figure out that we're asking the algorithm to ingest the right data and learn the right patterns and deliver the things that we actually care about. But I never want to say the problem evaporates or the risk evaporates, right? Because what we often find as we design and develop these systems is that they do behave in ways that are unexpected sometimes, that they do pick up on patterns that we didn't anticipate being in the data.
Sorry, let me not say no risk. Let me say the particular risk that you're describing of this feedback loop where deployment generates more arrests, unless you think that extra police deployment perversely increases gun violence, in which case we have far bigger problems in algorithms.
Well, let me actually give you another example that's related to this. In many communities, they're now trying to put surveillance systems in place that will include auditory surveillance that will detect the sound of gunshots, right? Now think about this. Are those sensors going to be distributed equally across a community, right? They cost a lot of money, right? You can see a possible decision that a policing agency might make to say, you know what, let's cluster most of these sensors in high crime neighborhoods, right? But remember, high crime neighborhoods is already something that's inflected with racial bias, with other kinds of over-policing bias that we know about. So what if the sensors are placed in particular neighborhoods with a different distribution from the beginning? Then you get the same sort of feedback loop, right? Where now, again, this is a hypothetical, but my point is that we need to remain vigilant from an ethical standpoint to these risks throughout the process of machine learning development. Because as soon as we become complacent and decide that we've solved the problem or there's no risk or we know exactly how the machine's going to behave and so we don't need to test it, we don't need to audit it on an ongoing basis, that's where we're going to see real harms come.
I would also say that we have to be vigilant about imagining that technology can solve a particular problem, because the problem of gun violence can be addressed through, theoretically it could be addressed through additional policing mechanism. It could also be addressed by gun reform. We could have fewer guns on the streets and then people would get shot less. It's like when people try and make apps to end homelessness or to help homeless people find more services. Like, that is great. Homeless people should have more services. But the way that you end homelessness is by giving people homes. Like, you reform that policy. Yeah. Like, there's not going to be an app that's going to fix that.
So we call this technological solutionism, the impulse to think that technology can simply repair social and political problems. I think technologies are invaluable tools for addressing many kinds of problems, including social and political problems, but they aren't magic. They aren't going to fix those things without the kind of wisdom, human wisdom, that needs to guide it. And what I hope is that we'll see AI being used to identify possible areas for reform and improvement, rather than being used as a Band-Aid to cover up failures or distract us from them or make us think that we've got an objective machine taking care of it so we don't have to look at this anymore. Yeah. So that's, I think, the difference between responsible use of this technology and use of this technology that ultimately over time could make things worse if we're not careful.
Right. So speaking of responsible uses of AI technology, Ron, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your work with autonomous weapons, the development of autonomous weapons, the non-development of autonomous weapons, and what kind of role protection plays in that.
Okay, first of all, I don't develop autonomous weapons. I
My
don't
mistake,
have
sorry.
autonomous weapons in my laboratory.
Do you have it in your pocket?
No, I don't. I did mention that to you earlier, but I was joking at the time. What I am concerned with is the fact that for many of us, including myself, we feel that autonomous lethal weapons are inevitable for a variety of reasons. One of those is they already exist, and they are deployed, at least by the definition of a roboticist and military personnel. Philosophers talk about moral agency and free will. These robots don't have that capability. They will never have that capability. They're always acting on behalf of individual soldiers or company commanders or generals or whatever. So I don't know if you call that a human in the loop, but a human is ultimately directing these kinds of systems. There's also an interesting distinction between the different domains that we've been talking about so far. Hiring, medical diagnosis, criminal justice, all leverage the deliberative capabilities of human beings. You have the time and the luxury to be able to think about what the right solution is. You have the luxury and the time to be able to try and come up with an explanation for your decision. If you're in the battlefield and you're being shot at, or you're being told to go clear a building, you may not have that same amount of time to be able to do that. And unfortunately, and I have the utmost respect for our young men and even our old men and women in uniform that are put into harm's way for national defense, but we need to make sure that these decisions, and they're split-second decisions often, do not result in inordinate amounts of non-combatant casualties. So bottom line is, my concern with autonomous weapons is to try and find ways to better protect non-combatants without mission erosion, or the military will never use them. If they don't do their job, they will not be able to carry out the particular task, and they won't ever get used. So this is not a social need, this is a military need in this particular case. This is not intended, and I don't advocate their use in domestic situations for policing or anything along those lines. But the military is different. There's operational tempo, and especially when you're potentially dealing with high-intensity interstate warfare, something we don't like to talk about, but you hear about it potentially every day now in the news, and you can pick your other state actor to engage in. The military wants to be ready for those sorts of things. And I've been engaged in this discussion with the United Nations for many years. 6 years it's been going on in Geneva. I presented at the first one. I had the honor to do that. I've briefed at the Pentagon and others, trying to ensure as best as possible, if and when, and I believe it's when, these systems continue to move forward into the battle space, that we find ways to better protect non-combatants. There's NGOs, and I have good friends with many of the major actors that are in the Stop Killer Robots campaign, the campaign against killer robots. But we differ in certain respects. I view these as the next generation of precision-guided munitions. Precision-guided munitions are intended to reduce non-combatant casualties. And if we could use artificial intelligence, and I'm not an advocate of not having explainability or other kinds of approaches for these things that you don't understand why it's doing what it's doing, but we can show empirically that there is an effective reduction in non-combatant collateral damage and reduction in property damage as well too associated with that, that these systems may have a place in very limited, narrow-bounded circumstances. In the military right now, there are certain systems where deliberation is of value. Right now, we fly Predators and Reapers over, take your place in the Mideast or in Africa that we happen to fly these things. There are multiple eyes on targets there. People can talk before they engage that target. They can even call up a lawyer, and often a lawyer's in the room, as to whether this is a legal thing to be able to do. So I have worked, and I guess this is for the next video, on something referred to as a ethical architecture, and in particular an ethical governor, as a proof of concept, not something that's intended to move out into the battle space, but to try and use a version of what's called deontic logic. It's a moral logic, which is the logic of obligations, permissions, and prohibitions, where obligations are given from a military commander for a robot to attack a target, and prohibitions are generated from the relevant international humanitarian law, Geneva Conventions, or what have you, and the rules of engagement to constrain that robot's action, to tell it when it is permitted to fire, and to tell it when, more importantly, it is not permitted to fire. We have no such immediate check and balance on human beings. There are wonderful stories of heroism in the battlefield. These systems will never replicate that. But there are, unfortunately, and well-documented, significant numbers of careless fire, unintended aiming, and actually atrocities as well, too, which kill incredible numbers of civilians on a daily basis. Pick your battlefield. You'll see it happening all the time. And the use of non-precision weapons, for example, led in Syria, where the Russians were using dumb bombs and we were using smart bombs, to greater casualties. I believe technology can, let me finish one sentence. I believe technology can, must, and should be used to reduce non-combatant casualties. And if not this way, we need to find another way.
Well, so how widespread is the use of killer robots, of autonomous weapons?
Lethal autonomous weapons, let's stay with what the UN has agreed to use as well, too.
All right.
As opposed to the pathos.
Well, okay, let's back up a second then. Let's talk about the difference between autonomous and semi-autonomous weapons, just so we're being specific about our terms here.
Well, this is one of the problems the UN has as well, too. There is no universally agreed upon definition of autonomy there, and there is no universally agreed upon definition of meaningful human control. Everyone wants meaningful human control. The only robot I know that doesn't have meaningful human control is a Terminator. I don't think anyone wants a Terminator. The military,
also, that's not real.
I know, exactly. And the real question is, autonomy is defined in the context of some of the military systems, is the ability of a system, when given a human order, to be able to, on its own, select a target, given that target signature, and engage that target without further human intervention. That's typically the definition that folks on my side of the discussion and the military would use for that.
Okay, so we've got a very precise definition, and then what are the laws governing use of these things?
Oh, well, at the broadest level, there's all kinds of laws from the Geneva Conventions. I should say there is no way that we will be able to implement anytime soon, if ever, all moral human faculties into a robotic system. That's not going to happen, okay? That's AGI, which you talked about last night as well, too, would have to happen at the same time as well, too, to be able to accomplish that. But in very narrow, bounded sets of circumstances, and this is the only place I advocate their use, such as room-clearing operations or counter-sniper operations, where human beings tend to make significant mistakes on being in fear or have all kinds of issues associated with generating a effective response. Under those circumstances, there are things, don't shoot non-combatants. And you only use these in situations where, as I said, high-intensity interstate warfare, where there is a significant reduction of the likelihood of encountering non-combatants. They can also assume more risk, potentially on behalf of a non-combatant. They don't have to take a shoot first and ask questions later strategy. They can take a first do no harm. They can only return fire with fire. Human warfighters, according to the standing rules of engagement, are allowed to engage a target when it exhibits hostility or exhibits hostile intent. Hostile intent is incredibly difficult to infer. And I would argue that these systems should not engage unless overt hostility is being shown under these circumstances.
Well, we have the Pentagon investing in artificial intelligence in weaponry. And we also have the phenomenon in the US where military surplus is ending up in the hands of the police. So Jens, are people in the criminology community talking about potential ways that we might, for example, stop these technologies from being deployed domestically?
I think that a lot of the policing decisions, so let's start off with the background for policing in the United States. We have a country of, a little over 300 million people. And alongside that, we have a little over 300 million guns. So policing in the United States, it's not exactly like being deployed to the Middle East, but when you go around with the police on the south side of Chicago, the number of guns in circulation is very salient as a key thing that they're worrying about. And so, I think if you think about the case that we had maybe a year or two ago in Dallas, where we had the shooting of, I don't know how many, you might remember how many police officers
I don't remember
were shot
the number,
by the gunman.
but I know the outcome of that.
So the outcome of that was that they were using something, this is not my area, so I don't know if you would define that as an autonomous or a semi-autonomous.
No, it was
but
a semi-autonomous.
Semi-autonomous that wound up resolving the threat in a way that saved a bunch of police officers' lives. I don't know how this is going to play out in the policing space. I think there are very few departments that I'm familiar with that are very far along in this. But I think the risks coming from split-second decisions in policing are at least as severe in the military case, and the difficulty of inferring intent is at least as severe in the policing. And so I think a lot of the trade-offs that we're going to be worrying about in the military application will be relevant for the policing case, and hopefully we'll be able to learn a lot from, I think DOD will be on the front lines of trying to sort out how to do this, and then policing will be on the trailing edge of that.
I argue against the use of this technology that's being developed in the military for domestic settings, where it shouldn't be used in counterinsurgencies in the military, from my point of view as well, too. Like I said, it should be at least first deployed in high-intensity interstate warfare. God forbid we have that, but if that's the case, it should be used there as opposed to somewhere else. Even the military has they don't operate under the rules of engagement. They operate domestically under the rules of the use of force, which is a whole different game, so to speak, if it is a game, which is probably it isn't. In policing, you can consider things in terms of siege. You can take time. You can actually not always, like in a police stop or something like that, but if there's people holed up in a house in a domestic setting, you don't have to rush in necessarily unless you know that there are people under threat. So it's a different type of environment. No one is really studying that environment in this context, and to me, that's probably appropriate at this point in time until the military can sort it out at the higher level, and then and only then can maybe it be considered. But I do not advocate its use at any time soon for policing operations.
I'll just jump in and say I think what this debate is showing is that one of the concerns we have about artificial intelligence is it's not clear that there is in many cases high-level policy that really has appropriate public input and critique, sort of shaping how this technology develops and where it flows, right? So one of the worries is mission creep for various kinds of uses of AI, where we start out with an application that we're comfortable with, that we've drawn a nice tidy bounding box around, and we say, okay, we're comfortable with it here. But then there will be these reasons, and it will be attractive for other uses. We talk in the AI ethics community constantly about dual use, right? And dual use can sometimes be a bad actor or a malicious actor doing something with this technology that you don't want, that you didn't anticipate. But sometimes dual use is not someone conventionally identified as a bad actor, but just a different agent in society or a different institution in society saying, I see how that could be useful over here. And if we don't have clear public standards about what the appropriate boundaries and principles are that are guiding the responsible use of this technology, it will bleed out into places where it is inappropriate or being used in inappropriate ways.
I can't agree more. Again, not only my domain, but I suspect your domains as well too. This new technology is outpacing our ability to regulate it and legislate for it as well, generate policy as needed. This is a very serious problem, whether it's we haven't even spoken about self-driving cars and the like as well too. How is that going to be managed? And another thing that we really haven't addressed, which is crucially important, is benchmarking and test and evaluation for these sorts of things. When is it appropriate for you to require that everyone use the software that you develop? When is it appropriate? How do you tell? I mean, we show this and this in the charts, but what is really the right answer for individual cases? Judges make mistakes.
We should actually make room in the world to say no to technology. I think the notion of requiring everybody to use technology for major decisions is a really flawed notion. So one of the things that I read about in my book is an idea called techno-chauvinism, which is the idea that technology is always superior to humans. And so in pushing back against techno-chauvinism, I think it's important to make room to say no when we don't want to use technology, to not force everybody.
I think we have to be careful with that, though, because the same sort of logic can be used to do things that pose a tremendous threat to public health. So, for example, the logic of saying, hey, people shouldn't need to vaccinate their children, even though not doing so poses an immense threat to the public over time through the loss of herd immunity, right? Or we make seatbelt laws.
I'm definitely not saying that
we should
let people not vaccinate.
But that's what I'm saying, is that we have to be able to say, I mean, in general, I think you're absolutely right. In general, I think we do need to carve out spaces where people can exercise choice and where there's accountability. I just want to say we need to leave room for those cases where we say, look, this particular application of the technology is the only way for this activity to be carried out safely, or the only way for this activity to be carried out in a way that doesn't pose an undue threat to the public. The same reason why we decide that people need to, have car seats and seat belts. And various kinds of safety technology in their cars. So I want to leave room for the possibility there might be applications of AI that one day we say, you know what, this is the only way to do this safely.
And the only way to do it better. So February of 2019, Congress mandated that every woman in the country needs to be told her breast density after having a mammogram. And that was done because it was well-intentioned. We want women to have information about their health. Well, it turns out that on average, 50% of women are now being told that they have dense breast tissue. And with this legislation, if you live in a state where the state is required to pay for additional imaging if you have dense breast tissue, there is creep up in being told that you have dense breast tissue. So we studied 85 radiologists, and we found when they read hundreds to thousands of mammograms at one end of the spectrum, they assessed 8% had dense breast tissue. At the other end, 85% had dense breast tissue. So that is something that's been mandated, it's been legislated. AI wasn't present. I think it's dangerous. I think it's misinforming women. But people aren't getting excited and upset about it because AI is not involved. Now, if we have a risk prediction model that can actually precisely inform women, whether they're Black or white or Hispanic or Asian ancestry, whether they know their family history or not, this is your future risk. And now we can start to have more precise medicine. Can we embrace that? When should we require that it be embraced? Because we require all kinds of things without the right data and the science to support that being good for people.
The language is, at least from my perspective, is when does it become a moral imperative? When we can demonstrably show that an AI system outperforms humans or whatever under a certain set of circumstances. The real question is, how do we demonstrably show that? And that's where the testing and evaluation of these systems lags at this point in time. But when that can occur, and I do believe it will occur in certain circumstances, there is a moral imperative to be able to pick that up.
And in my domain in healthcare, the question is always, are we holding AI to higher standards than non-AI. And I see that in healthcare all the time. We are complacent about medical treatments. We are complacent about screening technologies. They don't involve AI. We bring AI in and there's more fear, there's more concern, there's more wait, stop. We don't want to do this until we really understand it. And so that's an interesting area.
Yeah, but I'm not as concerned about holding AI to at least an equal, if not higher standard than human performance. There are secondary considerations, of course, in any of these things. Radiologists could be put out of work if you can ultimately do a better job. Right on the machine, the light comes up and says, do you have a certain percentage of likelihood of doing that? You still have a physician nearby to be able to assist, and what do you do once you have that particular diagnosis? Don't we have that now, even with chemical tests and other things
Absolutely,
as well, too?
absolutely. And that's been where we want to link and leverage on our history to say we don't have hematologists looking at microscopes counting red blood cells. We don't have pathologists looking at the microscope on pap smears. These have been automated. Computers, machines do them better, and we have embraced that. And the jobs of hematologists and pathologists exploded with the better technology. The same thing will happen.
That speaks to what we call the ever-vanishing horizon definition of artificial intelligence. As soon as it occurs, it vanishes into the background, and we accept it. We see this in almost everything, in your cars, in your washing machines, in your toasters, everywhere. There's what used to be called artificial intelligence, and now it's just a standard part of the product line.
I think. Sorry, I was going to say I think that this kind of reflex to hold back AI in the policy area, especially in criminal justice, I think is driven in large part by concerns about fairness. And I think that we do that without thinking about the fairness of the status quo. So we've been doing, we have a paper that came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics last year that I'll describe briefly for those of you whose QJE subscriptions lapsed somehow. And so we got data from a large anonymous American city of 8.6 million people. And in this city, you can see that fully 90% of the people who judges are currently sending for pretrial detention are African American and Hispanic. In a city where the general population is not anything like 90% African American or Hispanic. So in discrimination law, they have this concept of disparate impact, where a facially neutral process generates very disproportionate harm against disadvantaged groups. So we showed that the judges, one of the reasons that the judges are detaining lots of people in general, they're detaining more people than they need to because they're substantially mispredicting defendant risk. And if we relied instead on the much more accurate predictions of defendant risk from an algorithm, you could reduce the jail population by 40% without any increase in crime. Right? That's the equivalent of being able to close the jail at the end of July every year without crime going up. And what's interesting about that is, who disproportionately benefits when we can substantially improve a system that has enormous disparate impact? It is those disadvantaged communities that we most want to help. And so in some sense, there's this underappreciated potential benefit if we can get the right rules and regulations in place to realize it, but there's this underappreciated potential benefit of AI to improve systems that are having disparate impact right now to create what you might think of as like a disparate benefit.
Yeah. I also want to point out that one of the things we haven't talked about is we're talking about what kinds of decisions AI can be good at. But we haven't yet talked about what kinds of decisions we want humans to remain good at, and how we ensure that the automation of decision making leaves room for human cultivation of our abilities, of our strengths, even if we don't think that we are perfect, which of course we're not, right? But I want to think about, for example, contexts like education, where there's a huge push to use AI. And in education, we have a lot of failures already in the system that are very attractive to try to use AI to address. But again, there's two ways to do that. One is to use AI as a bandage or a bridge over some of the gaps in the broken system. And the other is to use AI as an impulse and a tool to really repair the system and to really bring human functioning into alignment with our values. And so, for example, if we have, let's say, knowledge that human teachers are expressing bias in the classroom in the way they mentor students or manage student behavior, right? What do we want? Do we want to put a machine in front of the students instead because we think the machine won't be subject to these things, even if we could figure out how to strip the bias out of the training data and all of that? Or is this relationship between a student and a teacher something that is important to human society and something that we don't want to just discard because it's imperfect, but something that we want to improve and sustain? And so thinking about how AI can be something that can raise human performance instead of replace it, I think is a really important goal to have. The problem is that in many cases, it takes more money and more time to use an AI to improve human performance than it does to simply replace the human and pull them out of the equation. So we need to make sure that commercial imperatives don't cause us to use AI in ways that are cheap and efficient, but ultimately degrade human performance and degrade human character.
We have such a great, I love it that you brought that up, because in healthcare, we have a crisis with physician burnout. And when we study why it's billions of dollars in this significant problem, physicians, for the most part, they went into medicine to take care of patients and to have that human engagement. And they increasingly, because of the computerization of our healthcare domains, have been pulled away from that. And I think there's opportunities to bring the human element back in, to allow physicians to go back to being the humans interacting with their patients and having the computers doing things that they actually don't enjoy and don't want to do, and is automated and routine. And the way teachers want more time with their individual students, but have so much work that they need to do that could be automated and they could be supported by. But I think for me, the AI to free us to go back to that human element of our jobs that drew us into it in the first place is really exciting.
I agree. I think part of it is, it's all about dignity to some extent as well, too, and maintaining human dignity in meaningful ways as we move forward. One way, perhaps, dealing with the teaching issues as well, too, is instead of replacing teachers, adding AI advisors as well, too, using AI to help them recognize their deficits in their decision making.
You know, I think not a lot of teachers need that, though. Like, I don't know any teachers who say, oh, I really wish I could have a computer tell me what I could do better. Like, you pretty much know what you could do better. And when you, in education, I'm a teacher.
So am I. I'm sorry. And you know, there are cases where I've had a deficit that I wasn't aware of. Some teachers have hemisphere neglect, which is sort of a silly deficit, but it's real. Like, you're literally only paying attention to half of the room, and you don't know it, right? Unless someone tells you that, hey, did you know you only look left? And so.
I agree. I think the idea that the teachers or anyone know.
Thing, though.
No, but I think the idea that you know what your strengths and weaknesses are, like, I think behavioral science tells us that is a very over-optimistic assessment of human performance, not just for teachers.
I love that, by the way, that you're
the,
like, well, we all think we know what we're doing, but nobody actually knows what they're doing. That's hilarious.
But an equally hard part is, if the system is actually giving good advice, is to find a way where the teacher or other human being would take that advice. This is hard to do, especially when you're dealing with a machine. It's hard enough to take advice from a human being quite often, let alone from a machine. There's a lot of work going on in human-robot interaction. There's things exploiting theory of mind as well, too, trying to understand how a machine can maintain an effective model of what a human being is either thinking or feeling at that point in time, to be able to understand when to give the advice. It's not just right now I'm going to tell you this is all wrong what you're saying. I wouldn't do that. I'd wait till later.
Well, and one advantage of using machines to support human decision making and enrich human decision making is that sometimes we can take this kind of advice from a machine more than we can take it from another human. So one of the other tools we use in teaching, right, is peer evaluations, where we have our colleagues come into our classroom and watch us teach and give us feedback. But these are also our friends and our colleagues, right, who don't always want to be honest with us about what our strengths and weaknesses are, because they don't want to damage that relationship. And if they are honest, it might damage the relationship because of my ego, right? And I don't want my, and I've seen this play out, for example, in cases where faculty might have unconscious biases with respect to gender or race in the classroom and treat, or how they treat students with disabilities, and sort of, these are very sensitive issues, and most of those biases are unconscious, and people feel that they're good people and feel that they're fair, and to be told you're not by another human is very hard to hear. But a machine sort of showing you the data and saying, look how many times you call on the male students in your classroom versus the women who have their hands up. Look at the percentage of time you miss that. That could be really useful feedback that people might receive with a more generous spirit.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the implementation of it, though. So a couple of years ago, I did a project about textbooks in Philadelphia public schools, because I was curious about the fact that Philadelphia schools could never get more than 50% of their students to pass the state-mandated standardized tests. And I thought, all right, I'm going to build software that's going to address this problem. It's going to fix it. And in fact, what I found was that you didn't need software to do a better job of passing the test. All you needed to do was read the book, because the same people who write the tests write the books, and the answers are in the books. And so then I asked the question, do Philadelphia schools have enough books? Like, does every kid have the book that they would need to pass the test? And the answer was no. And I got there by building artificial intelligence software, because nobody had ever asked that question before. So my concern is that in our current world, when we start saying, oh, we should build a computer system to do this, we start neglecting a lot of basics, right? So getting computers into the hands of every kid in every classroom is a terrific goal. I think kids should have access to all the technology they need, but the reality is that public school classrooms all over the US, they don't have enough electrical ports in the classrooms to plug in 30-odd computers. They don't have air conditioning in the schools to prevent the computers from overheating. So when I think about a system that would track teachers and tell them, oh, you have a hemisphere deficit, I think there are so many other things that we're doing so badly already. Let's get the basics in place before we start worrying about the fancy computer systems.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. And I do think it doesn't have to be an either or. I think we could pursue both. But you're absolutely right that we are neglecting some really fundamental social failures in our institutions today. And we shouldn't be so distracted by the hype that can sometimes surround technology, including AI, that we're more interested in what it can do than the other kinds of problems that might be more urgent and might be calling to us. So I agree, but I would like to see both of these things happening together. That is, that we take account of the health of our institutions and use the right tools when we have them to help us rebuild those institutions. But if we just try to use the technology as a patch on the existing systems, we are going to not only fail to flourish as much as we can, but we're going to introduce some new problems, right? Because we do see that AI can function as an accelerant, as a magnifier, and a multiplier. And if you have a system that already has a good drift going to it and you want to amplify and accelerate that, that's great. Or if you use it in a targeted way to try to counteract a problematic drift, that's good too. But what can happen in a lot of places when AI isn't deployed with social and moral intelligence is what happens is you just inject it into a system where it amplifies problematic trends that are already there. So that's what we have to avoid. And that's not an issue of avoiding AI. It's using AI in combination with social, political, and moral judgment.
Yeah, well put. I like the idea of infusing AI with social and moral intelligence, because I think especially in criminology, for example, there's such substantial existing racial bias in policing that if we're just naively implementing AI tools, we run the risk of implementing those same biases on a much wider scale. So really thoughtful AI is a really great thing to think about. So we've looked at some scenarios that are very positive. We looked at some scenarios that are, frankly terrifying. So what are the and one of the things that people often say when they talk about AI is they say, "Oh, AI is coming and it's out of control, and we don't have any way to resist it. That it's inevitable. That we just have to sit back and let it happen to us." And so, what are some of the ways that people can think about AI and think about ways that we can have control as a society? What are some points of intervention that still exist?
I'd like to just start by talking about this. I'm so glad you brought this up, because this is the thing that I have to fight against most often in talking with technologists and talking with policymakers, because this rhetoric is surrounding us, this idea of technological inevitability. Technology is human all the way down. Technology is not alien to us. We are technological creatures. We started using tools pretty much as soon as we climbed down from the trees, and the technologies shape us and we shape our technologies. So there's nothing inhuman about technology, and that goes all the way into AI. So if we think about technology as something alien that comes to us, and then we just have to accept it as it is, right? That's a really dangerous framing. If we think about AI as something we are building and we are shaping with our choices, then we see it as our responsibility, and we recognize that there's many possible trajectories that AI could take. So it's not the question of what will AI be when it gets here, or what will AI be tomorrow. It's what will we make it? What will we choose to do with AI? So as long as we keep human responsibility at the center of AI now and in the future, I think we'll be on a much better path.
I agree 100%. I like how you said that also, because there is the language that we use is one that does instill fear and resistance. We don't want to change. It's man versus machine.
AI is coming.
It's coming, and will it take over your life? Will it take over your job? Will it take over your mind? And this is such mythological, futuristic science fiction that is delaying the power that it could have to improve the human condition. And I also love the language you use of how we as humans are integrating this, how we are using it. AI is what we make it. It is what humans, how we use it as tools. It is what we do. It is the choices that we make with it. And so what we are really wanting to do in healthcare is to first tackle the problems our patients face and having that dialogue with them as we introduce it with all the stakeholders. How can we use this? How can we improve the human condition? And how can we make the most of these tools together in a thoughtful way? So I really appreciate that.
I was going to say, I think that the other way that it feels critical for there to be intentionality is to take testing and evaluation really seriously. So the Food and Drug Administration requires a drug company to do several waves of randomized clinical trials to make sure any new medication actually works before we start giving it to patients. We should take the evaluation of algorithms just as seriously before we start deploying them in scale. And I think the ProPublica example that you gave before, I think, is a perfect illustration of something that went from design stage to large-scale implementation without anybody thinking, why don't we make sure that we look at this and see whether it's doing what we want it to do before we put it out in the world. Yeah.
And I hate to kind of put a damper on this wonderful euphoria which is in front of us, but I just want to mention again, we have to be cognizant of the risks that are present by this technology. And if we aren't cognizant of it, I don't know where we'll end up, not probably the dystopian futures that you were alluding to. But there are organizations, the IEEE Global Initiative on Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, has hundreds of AI and social scientists and lawyers and others just generated a book about this thick with guidelines for the field. It's the largest professional society in the world, if I'm not mistaken, as well. The World Economic Forum has just stood up a council to be able to try and come up with guidelines for these sorts of things. So people are appropriately concerned, But we don't need fear. It's not that close. If AI is coming, it's not on top of us. We have to guide the use of any technology, whether it's guns or whether it's AI or whatever it is. It can be used in ways that are anathema to the benefit of humanity. We do want everything that you said, and I hope we can get there.
I will also shout out the Algorithmic Justice League for doing some great work on this front. In addition to, I'm sure IEEE is doing some interesting stuff. Also check out Data for Black Lives, AI Now, and Data in Society. So this has been a really interesting discussion. I want to thank you in the audience. I want to thank our panelists, Jens Ludwig, Connie Lehman, Shannon Valor, and Ron Arkin. Thank you all for coming today. It's been such a pleasure.